everyone, and welcome to Jack Byrne, a revolutionary century as part of Liverpool Irish Festival. Sorry, need to put my teeth in. It's really wonderful to see you all here. We're really proud to be running this event in partnership with Liverpool Literary Agency, and I'm delighted that I'm going to be able to introduce you to Jack Byrne and to Greg Query. I'm going to come back at the end, and we'll also have a bit of a Q&A. So if anybody wants to drop any questions into the chat so that we know that we've got some questions coming in, that would be really useful. But at the end, we will ask people to put their hands up and make themselves known if there are more questions to follow. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Greg.
Thank you, Emma. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, welcome everybody, and thank you very much indeed for coming along to this discussion between Jack Byrne and myself. Before we start, I just want to say a few words for those of you who may not know that we lost a very important person in our Liverpool Irish community just last week, and that was Tony Birtle, who passed away in the hospice at Fazakerley Hospital. He had been ill for some time. Tony was born in Walton, Liverpool. He was a fluent Irish speaker and a long-standing teacher of the Irish language here in Liverpool. He was a freelance journalist for many years, and he was a tutor at the Irish Language Summer School in Donegal, which is a considerable achievement for somebody born and brought up here in Liverpool. His book, A Hidden History, tells a history of the Irish language in Liverpool, and it was Tony's original search for that book that brought forward the fact that there were a very large number of Irish speakers living in Liverpool in the 19th century and early 20th century. Tony revived Conrad na Gaeilge, the Gaelic League in Liverpool. He researched the life of Piers Beasley, who was one of the leading in the Irish, the rise of 1916 and the struggle for independence. He erected a plaque in memory of Piers Beasley in Walton, where Beasley was born. And Tony was a very much loved and highly respected member of our community, and we're very sad to have lost him, but he has left us with a lot to celebrate in his life. We've had this discussion. The idea was instigated by Jack. Jack's book, Under the Bridge, is a novel and a mystery story about life in Garston in the 1950s and 60s along the docks. But it contains a wonderful picture of the realities of life in that area and the social and political environment in which people lived. My book, In Hardship and Hope, is a straightforward history book, but you could learn almost as much about the history of Liverpool from reading Jack's book. Just as a short introduction, I think it's important to put Jack's book in the context of Liverpool Irish Catholic writers, of whom there have been a large number. Those who took to writing novels and biographies include James Hanley, who wrote more than 30 novels in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And one reviewer said of Hanley, if you're looking for a good laugh, you should try looking elsewhere, because Hanley's books were quite dark in what they portrayed. They didn't hold back in portraying the hardships that people were living through and the difficult times that people in the Liverpool Irish community encountered. Another was George Garrett, who, like Hanley, also went to sea. His unfinished biography, 10 Years on the Parish, describes the unemployment marches and the Unemployment Association. He was a founder of the Unity Theatre, and he very vividly describes the realities of life in Liverpool. Pat O'Mara, who wrote the Liverpool Irish Slummy, He again has got an unrelenting picture of the violence about his pious mother, about evictions in Liverpool, about and the fractured identity of people being brought up as Irish in a British city and going through the British and Catholic education system. Lynn Andrews from Fazakerley is another, who came from a working class background, but has been a very successful novelist, and most of her work is set in this Liverpool Irish community. And Burley Doherty from Notty Ash is another female writer who has been very successful and comes from that Liverpool Irish community. And Jack's book is part of a succession to those writers, because he also has used that Liverpool Irish environment as inspiration for his book. And I think those writers have used their experience of living in Liverpool in so much of their work because there's so much material there. There's so many human stories and the challenges that people faced. And there's such rich material, which Jack has exploited in his book, which, like the authors I've just been quoting, deals with the realities of life in Liverpool. And unlike history books such as I've written, Jack's book takes you down right inside the community and gives voice to the community, so you can find out from reading the book and listening to the voice of the characters what life was like and what were their concerns and their fears and their challenges. And at this point, I think I'll invite Jack to come in and tell us a bit about the book and what, Jack, was it that drove you to put pen to paper or put finger to typewriter or whatever?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. It's partly, I don't know, it's partly what you're saying. You know, I've had a couple of chats with Greg now, and really interesting guy, and really recommend his book, In Hardship and Hope. And so if you haven't got it, then you should get it. Partly because it tells the story of Liverpool and the Irish community in Liverpool in a way that I hadn't seen it before. And that was part of the reason for me doing my book. You know, Greg listed off the novelists, and I've written them all down. But when I was growing up in school, I didn't find these people. I wasn't told about these people. I didn't know where to find them. And for me, there was a gap between the Irishness that existed in my family, if you like. My dad came over from Wicklow after the Second World War, and the lived experience that I had in the 60s and the 70s growing up in Speak. And, you know, there's a story which is true, and I'll say it. When I was about 16, you know, in the bedroom in Dymchurch Road in Speak, I started writing a biography of my dad. And my dad, you know, was a painter and decorator from Wicklow, came over after the Second World War. I got about half a page and then didn't know what else to do with it. You know, what do you do? He was a normal working guy. And it was only later, and literally, you know, finishing this book, that this book is his kind of story. It's not directly his story. And the family, you know, is not my family. But it is, the family is like ours, the people like us, who, you know, like my dad, came across after the Second World War, and the experience that they had in Garston, in Liverpool generally, and up toward the 2000s. I don't want to go on too much, you know, but there's one thing that Greg's book does for me, which is why I think it's really good. Well, first of all, it's written in a really accessible way. I've read other stuff, you know, and a lot of it, you know, there's the Irish Studies Department in the university in Liverpool now. I think started in the 80s, and they produce some great stuff, but it is academic. Greg's book is accessible to everyone, and it's a kind of history that we should know. And I think for me, this history wasn't promoted, it wasn't shared, and I struggled to find it. And so my book was part of kind of creating that story. So at least, you know, I could document that element of it. But what Greg's book does is it joins the gap, if you like. Post Second World War, the Irish community had moved out to the North End. Slum clearances redeveloped most, not all, of the North End of the city. And lots of people went out to places like Speke, Kirby, Netherley. And those old kind of communities that Greg charts in the book very clearly, where the Irish language was spoken, where they had community organizations, where there was an Irish MP up to, just before 1920. That was lost for me. And it's been a process of recovering that. And so that's what the book partly was about. But let me say, it's a thriller. There's a dead body in the first chapter that's dug up on a building site in Garston, close to the docks. And as a young reporter, Anne is from Liverpool 8, her dad's from the Caribbean, and her friend Vinny, who wants to be a history professor. He's done a degree, but he's working in a crap shoe shop. He can't get a decent job. He's on 0 hours and so on. But he helps Anne try and track down what happened to this body, how it got there, who it was, and then they get into a story, or they uncover a story of strikes and gangs and police corruption in the 1950s and on through the decades up to the 2000s. So that's the overall outline of it. Hope it wasn't too long.
Jack, would you like to read us something from the book to give us a flavour?
Yeah, I will. The bit I'm going to read is quite near the beginning. It's Vinny. The first chapter, the body is discovered. But Vinny has his own mission. The first time we see Vinny, he's biking it up Princess Avenue, going toward the university. He wants to get an MA course in history. He wants to be a historian. And so this is his first kind of interview with his supervisor at university. But he's just getting off his bike. And someone gives him a leaflet. A woman gives him a leaflet. He didn't wait for a reply. He scanned the leaflet as he edged his way through other campaigners and took the 3 steps into the building. Justice for cleaners. He did something he would never have done if Anne were with him. He scrunched up the leaflet and tossed it in a waste bin just inside the double doors. He checked his phone, bang on time. Vinny walked through the high arched main entrance into a wide atrium and felt the cool air on his face. The contrast between the busy street outside and the cathedral-like interior was immediate. Wow, he thought, this is where I belong. He looked up to the richly decorated ceiling, rectangles of deep blue with red and gold borders. The wide open space below had a polished floor, and the blood-red ceramic tiles covered the walls up to the first floor level. Not an easy place to clean, he realized, thinking of the Justice for Cleaners woman. The heavy balustrade around the first floor gallery, supported by columns, dressed in the same deep red tiles. He scanned the room list of plastic letters and numbers on a brass stand. He found her, Dr. A. Sheehan, room 4B. The brass nameplate shone yellow gold with age. Tiny, almost invisible swirls indicated years of assiduous polishing. Vinny knocked lightly and waited before inching the door open. The heavy oak door swung too easily on its hinges, opening faster than he'd intended. The first thing he saw was a crucifix. The body hung heavily with arms outstretched, sinews and muscles strained. A crown of thorns with sharp points sticking out of the world or embedded in the skull of the drooping head. Rivulets of deep red blood were streaking down a pained, angular face. Fuck, Vinny thought. Yes, someone from within called out. He opened the door wider. Sorry, Sheehan, Professor Sheehan? The woman behind the oak desk looked busy, distant, turning away from the computer screen to face him. Yes, she said again. Vinny, Vincent Connolly, I have an appointment. Come in, Mr. Connolly. She checked her wristwatch and smiled. Entering the room, he closed the door behind him and made his way over the carpeted floor to the chair facing the broad oak desk. I'm sorry, forgive me. I get so carried away at times. Is it Vincent? She asked, pushing her glasses high on her head. They balanced precariously on her bunched up hair. Yes, it's Vincent. He hoped the formality would equate with gravitas. He took a deep breath to try and settle himself and sat upright, leaning slightly forward. So, Vincent, she started looking through papers on her desk. How can I help you? I raised the idea of investigating Irish immigration into the UK after the Second World War. I have the emails here. He rifled through his bag. Ah, yes, that, Mr. Vincent Connolly. No need. With a wave of the hand, she released him from his search. I remember. She smiled, leaning back in a chair, her arms resting on a black leather. On a shelf behind her head, he could see a number of titles, including her most celebrated work, The Making of Modern Identity, A History of Liverpool. Dr. Sheen's voice was soft and melodic. He couldn't quite work out the accent. Go on, I'm listening, she said. Vinny took a breath and launched into his practice spiel. There's a wealth of material available from the 1840s and 50s on the effects and consequences of the famine and mass emigration from Ireland. There has, however, been very little research on the scale and impact of changes since then. Everything seems to stop around World War II. Some of the largest changes in the structure of Liverpool have been since that period. The slum clearances, the building of new housing developments on the edge of the city. This was all happening when there was a shortage of labour. This shortage was partly filled by returning troops, but it also required an influx of Irish workers. Okay, that's a fair point. And although I think some people are beginning to look into this, you are correct. It's an under-researched area. Can I ask what your interest in this is? Are you Irish? Vinny allowed himself to relax back against the chair. No personal interest, he said. I just think it's an area rich in potential. It's a period when a lot was going on. The city was changing, not only geographically, but culturally. It's also when the Scouse identity was being developed. Connolly is an Irish name, isn't it? She asked. I guess so, but I was born here, Vinny said. So you are English, Irish, and Scouse? She asked. Vinny thought for a moment. He'd never heard it put that way before. Does it matter? He asked. Not to me, she replied, but you may find it does to you. Okay. All right, so that's the introduction to Vinny and Vinny's dilemma. And in a nutshell, English, Irish, or Scouse, a combination of the three, which one is more important? And then through the book and the struggles to find the identity of the body near the docks, then a lot of Liverpool's history is unearthed, and he comes to some form of resolution to that question.
And that particular passage was focused on Vinny and his being at the university, Liverpool University. But there's also a very strong focus on the Garston Docks and a gang operating there, an Irish gang, people who had come over from Ireland and who were making their living through nefarious activities along the docks. And before we get to that, I would just say that as well as the movement of the story through the book, there are some very vivid passages. One is where, right at the beginning, where a lorry driver breaks a picket line, has to get through a picket line. And second one, I think one of the ones that stands out for me is there's a very good description in the book of one of the characters leaves the gangster way of life and goes to work in Ford's. And there is such a good description of the working on the night shift at Ford's. It really brings you in there. And I thought that was a passage.
It was actually Standard Triumph, Greg.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Right.
Before they closed it. Yeah, it was Triumph in Speak before they closed it.
Yeah. So things like that really bring you into the Liverpool of that era. But I think, Jack, you're quite anxious to say more about this question of the identity of Liverpool. Is it got an Irish identity or an English identity or a combination of the two?
Well, I think, first, I appreciate you highlighting those passages. The book starts in the 2000s with Anne and Vinny, but then it goes back to one of the main characters, Michael. And Michael's just come across from Ireland, and he meets up with family of friends, family in Garston, and they're involved in some robbing off the docks, and he gets involved in that. Later on, he decides that he's going to kind of, try and make his own way, and he ends up getting that job in Standard Triumph. The reason I think they're important, and, I do think those passages work well, but for me, why they're important is because that's what people can relate to. I've worked on a night shift, not in Standard Triumph, but in a car factory. And I don't think there are that many novelists who have, but there are certainly tens, hundreds, thousands of workers who have. And, for me, our lives are at the center of this book and the other books that will follow. The next one is out in the spring. But just like my dad was a painter and decorator, people who work in factories. And there, the introduction to that bit, I know it was kind of, the university boring bit, but there was a Justice for Cleaners lady who was campaigning for a decent wage, minimum wage, or after, with holidays and all the rest of it, but campaigning for decent pay. And that is the experience that so many people go through that is just not recorded, or not recorded as art or literature. There have been exemplary examples, Boys from the Black Stuff. I think everybody knows and recognizes that. They're kind of seminal moments in TV. There are some filmmakers, Ken Loach, who does it as well. But in the overall scheme of things, it's a drop in the ocean of the daily content of people's lives. And I think there's space for more of that. And part of that, yes, is the question of Ireland and Scouse identity, Liverpool identity, Irish identity. There's this kind of symbiotic relationship, a deep connection between Liverpool and Ireland. But Greg, I'm going to ask you to comment, because one of the things that kind of annoyed me as I was getting older, you hear people flippantly talk about, Liverpool as the capital of Ireland. And it annoyed me. It annoyed me because when I was growing up, in the 70s, there were some jokes about Irish people, or they were, only talked about on the news as terrorists and bombers. And there wasn't, that identification as Irish. And it's kind of throwaway, flippant thing. Oh yeah, everybody knows that the Liverpool is full of the Irish or Irish people. But for most of the history, there was real opposition to the Irish in Liverpool. And that's not a known part of kind of the cultural history.
Mm-hmm.
What do am I overplaying that, Greg, or is that real?
Well, before I answer that, Jack, I'll just say to people, if you do have questions, we're going to answer questions in a moment. You can put the questions into the chat, and Emma will find them there. There's a chat button at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, you should find somewhere where you can type in. Or you could just put your hand up whenever questions come up later on. But as regards that Irish identity in Liverpool, historically, a lot of the Irish Nationalist Party in Liverpool, a very strong political party, more or less disappeared whenever a parliament was established in Dublin in 1921. And another factor is that Liverpool did not have the great influx of people in the 1960s and 70s to the same extent that you did in Manchester and Birmingham. And one of the things I say in my book is that the Liverpool's Irish identity manifested itself in Catholicism. That it became, Catholicism was for Irish nationalists a kind of a badge of nationalism for many generations. And the Catholic Church was an institution with, its priests and nuns and church buildings and so on. So it was very powerful, and people did look to it for social services before the state took over that role. So a lot of that Liverpool Irish identity became a Catholic thing. But then later on in the 60s, the Scouse identity, some people call it, a new Liverpool identity emerged, which was much more unified than the Protestant and Catholic culture that had gone before it. But it may be one of the things that you're hinting at, Jack, is that there was a very strong sectarian thread to Liverpool culture up until comparatively recent times. And that, I think, might have suppressed some of that Irish feeling. And also, whenever the Troubles kicked off in the North, a lot of people were not going to go out and celebrate their Irishness too much.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you and I accept that. And I think partly, I don't know, but part of my feeling is that, there is this theory or idea, and in practice, with, I don't know at what level each is true, that Scouse overtook the separate identities in Liverpool. So Protestant, English, Irish, and everyone merged into Scouse. And that kind of is a fulfillment to some degree, if you like, of Irishness. And I'm not convinced. I have to be honest about it. I think, one of the things for me is kind of, and I know it's so obvious and it's so out there and up, but, it still, makes me think. You look at the Beatles, when all around the world, 1960s, the epitome of that, culture, the beat culture in the 1960s and moving on. There's a common phrase, certainly wasn't invented by me, but the best band that Ireland never had, because all of them had Irish roots, Irish ancestry to some degree or other, and a stronger level than other in most of their lives. And it's only later, in the mid-70s, late 70s, that you get Paul and John both looking back and kind of rediscovering their Irishness, because for them as well, it wasn't a part of that movement. It was, this is the Mersey beat, this is Liverpool. And for me, I think there's always been an element of that, it's happy to subsume Irish culture into Scouse and say, we're all one thing together now. Great if it is. But I still think we need to understand, what happened in the 70s and in the 80s and before that, to waves of Irish people, which is still going on. This thing doesn't end. The kind of waves of emigration constantly, and it's just that I think we should be aware of the nuances of these things.
Yes, there was still a very strong Irish culture in the 1950s. I interviewed, a lot of people about that time. Tommy Walsh talks about being, the caller for Irish ceilidhs in parish halls, one night after the other in the 1950s, and even after redevelopment, when people moved out, although the very tightly knit Catholic communities were broken up. I spoke to people who talked about the new churches which were built in Kirby and Highton. I interviewed people from there. They're saying those churches were packed for many years after people moved out. But it was in the 60s that there seemed to be a big transformation, that church attendance fell off. Lots of people left their Catholic religion. And a lot of the Irish practices, I think, declined at around about the same time. So there's something happened there that needs to be explained. And I'm sure people...
I just want to say that, I don't think that, this is some kind of sinister thing if somebody's sitting there pulling the strings and, I just think, it it's the culture that surrounds us and the space that people feel they have to celebrate. And yeah, you know, I mean, I was part of St. Christopher's in Speke, and they had the church club. It was a drinking club. I was never aware of any kind of cultural activities like dancing or ceilidhs in St. Christopher's, but I'm sure other places did, you know, and I'm not, you know, trying to say that my experience is the only one. There are lots of different ones that feed into this. But I think, you know, it ebbs and flows with the culture that's around us. And I think there's no question that the 70s was not a time where people felt free to celebrate their Irishness in public. Maybe, you know, in the church social club, you know, then yeah, that's kind of like what they call now kind of a safe space. But, you know, outside of that, then I think it was far more difficult. And I appreciate, and I think it's a really good thing since the Good Friday Agreement. I think, you know, things have really started taking off again, you know, in the sense of people being, you know, celebrating that legacy and that history. And so it does move in waves, but, you know, I just think it's something that we should be aware of.
Mm-hmm. I've got a short passage from my book here about the process in the 1960s. Increasing civic pride and rising self-esteem became important factors in the outstanding success of two local institutions, Liverpool and Everton football clubs. In an article in the Irish Post, Tony Birtle reflected on the decline of sectarianism in Liverpool, where the experience has contrasted with both Glasgow and Belfast. Soccer, a divisive force in Scotland, helped bring people together in Liverpool, Tony said, with Everton FC and Liverpool FC enjoying support from both Catholics and Protestants. End of quote. This point of view is reinforced in Keith Daniel Roberts' research, Liverpool Sectarianism, the Rise and Demise. In his words, despite the city's downturn, the city's two football teams became key repositories of loyalty, and red and blue began to eclipse orange and green amid broader social processes of secularism, even if the outright repudiation of religion was less marked in Liverpool than it was elsewhere. So that's just a little bit of a passage where I'm discussing how that new Liverpool identity emerged, particularly with cultural factors, not just football, but music and city success in lots of other fields.
Okay, if I can, I mean, I agree. You know, I agree with that explanation, and you know, it's based on the evidence and so on. But there's an interesting question as to why, since the Good Friday Agreement, that things have opened up more in the UK. You know, this Liverpool Irish Festival has been going for 14 years, so 2006 or 7. But that's in the 2000s. The St. Patrick's Day parades have restarted. I think it was 2012, I'm not sure. I think that one was actually forced off the streets. There was a mobilization of EDL and the Orange Order to try and stop the march taking place. So I believe. And, you know, it's back on the agenda again, which I think is great. But these things are happening now, and it's resurfaced now. But the football teams are doing better than ever, commanding more, you know, attention and respect internationally and within the city as well. So, you know, for me, it's connected to the politics of the state and to what the British state is doing, and it's connected to empire, and it takes different forms. That right-wing mobilization, but it existed then, it existed in the 60s and the 70s, and it still exists now. But it takes different forms and has different targets at different points. And, you know, Brexit and the nationalism around that, you know, targeting, you know, for years before that, Muslims and immigrants and the war on terror and so on. So the focus shifts, but that defensive empire exists and has always existed. It didn't stop in the 60s and it didn't go away in the 60s. And we can see that by what happened in the 70s and the 80s in terms of the militarization of the struggle in Ireland on both sides, not just by nationalists fighting, against the British government, but by the British government consciously, to do that. So anyway, but you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean?
I'll just make two remarks related to that before we go on to giving people the opportunity to ask questions. One is that undoubtedly the effect of things like the Prevention of Terrorism Act discouraged people from taking part, certainly in any Irish activity related to politics. I was involved in the campaign to free Maura O'Shea, who was imprisoned in Liverpool. But if you went to one of those meetings, your car registration number was taken by a guy who was standing across the road. So that was very discouraging. But another thing that did happen in the 80s, a younger generation, my sons who were brought up in Liverpool, was in my generation, we've been dealing with anti-Irish racism and anti-Irish jokes, which I had to challenge in their primary school of all places. They grew up in an atmosphere where that was largely gone, and they were much more relaxed about celebrating their Irish identity. And if my memory serves me correct, when I came to Liverpool in 1971, 72, I don't recall there being any obviously Irish pubs with a tricolour hanging up outside. But today, in contrast, you could, I'm sure, count 100 tricolours if you in a short walk around Liverpool city centre, which is, I'm not saying that they know any more about Irish culture than they would have done 20 or 30 years ago, but it is certainly is, there's a big attitudinal change there as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you mentioned another time we were talking, you mentioned the Pogues, as a kind of, I don't know, advanced guard of Irish culture, if you like, or that rebellious spirit, from the mid-70s, punk, the Pogues were the later end of the 70s. And I think within that kind of counterculture of that time, then I think there was a real pushback against not just the Irish jokes, but the racist jokes. You remember Bernard Manning and those people on the comedians every Saturday night on television. It was disgusting stuff. It's unbelievable that it was there on primetime TV, prime slot on a bloody Saturday night. But there was a pushback against that. And the Pogues and the cultural movement around that was a big part of that. And not forgetting, the movements of the mobilization of people in Ireland itself, the hunger strikes, awful thing, tragic thing, but mobilized people, pushed the issue forward and said, and it made a lot of people think about which side are they on, not just in a black and white sense, but, in terms of looking at themselves, their place in the world and their part in history. Some within the North, some of the marches, around the funeral of Bobby Sands and so on, I remember the numbers. They were amazing. It was like 100,000 people. You compare that to the percentage of the population in the UK, it would be like, 2 million people on the streets or something. But where I was, if I was involved in activity, which I was, in support of the hunger strikers, it was very, very difficult, to raise those issues at different points. Like I say, it went up and down. There were places, I was in some engineering factories and I would be arguing that the British troops shouldn't be in Ireland. That was my position. I came to that, as a kind of late teenager, I guess, as part of my rediscovery of, who our family was. And, I'm not going to, but it's kind of like one of my brothers was in the army, joined the British Army and died in Ireland. And for somebody from an Irish background, that's a kind of, a wake-up call. What the hell's going on here? And that's part of this book and the next book says, how did we end up in a situation where that kind of thing could happen? At the time, he was actually a supporter of Enoch Powell. And he was an Everton fan, went to match every week. But you know what I mean? These things are not black and white. They're not easy. But I think they're part of real questions that need to be asked about, partly why they need to be asked about the past. Why don't we just move on and let it go and forget it? Because it hasn't gone away. That's my thing. That those forces are still around, still exist. And the question of empire, which was at the heart of those whole things, is more powerful now than ever. Why? Because the government, the Tories, are falling back to it. It's the last line of defense, if you like. Stand with the flag, with us, against whoever. At the moment, it's probably Europeans. A bit earlier it was Muslims. A bit earlier again it was black people and Irish. Who knows who the next target will be? And it's not to say it can't swing back round again. Okay, so sorry, but these are the kind of issues that I've been working through the book. And I know that I'm not making it sound like an exciting thriller, but it is. Believe me, look at the reviews and believe some of the people who've read it. But underneath that, these real societal questions that I think are really important and should be dealt with, in literature.
I'm sure, Jack, you've ignited some thoughts in people's heads. And I was just wondering, Emma, if anybody's got a question for Jack or indeed for myself.
Yeah, I've had a couple in. I'm sorry, my sound seems to be a bit funny. Is it echoing for you?
A little, but we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. One of the things that I wanted to pose in this kind of context of us setting up an exchange here between both you two as writers, but also as fiction and history writers, I'm wondering what the responsibility is of a fictionalist who is using truth and history in their work in terms of how you deal with the people who are living with that history. I just wonder what the responsibility is as a writer to that history.
Okay, if I can, do you want to say, Greg, or?
I'll let you go first on that, Jack.
Yeah, okay. For me, in Writing Under the Bridge, I was very, the beginning story, Greg mentioned, one of the main characters is driving a truck, a lorry through the dock gates. He's basically crossing a picket line, breaking a strike in 1955. The strike, there were strikes at that time around those issues. Is the organization of the Blue Union, which people wanted because they felt it was more closely aligned with what they wanted as dockers. They could fight. But anyway, but there were real strikes at that time around those issues that are covered in the book. The characters are kind of fictional, but they're kind of half not. And it's a really good question. There's one guy in the book, Bob Pennington, and I've used his real name. He was an organizer for the Blue Union on the docks in Garston in the mid-1950s. I met him in the late 70s, and I knew him for a period in the 70s. He's died now. And he died, as far as I know, in not the best circumstances, if you like. And for me, it was an act of tribute. At least somebody somewhere is going to write down that this guy, organized, spent his time, his effort, his energy, gave up part of his life to organize for better conditions for workers in Garston. I think that's an act of tribute. And so, and it's an act of, it's part of expressing the reality. Stephen King has this famous thing where he says fiction is the truth wrapped up in a lie. And that, the book is fiction, but a lot of it is true. And I hope that when people read it, they feel that and they get that truth from it. But yeah, I do think we have a responsibility. The biggest responsibility is to tell that truth, not to dress it up, not to use it as a political club, but to represent it as close as we can from what we know to what it was.
Greg, do you want to add into that?
Just a couple of remarks on that, Emma. One is that and I became aware just as I was finishing my book that it is a big responsibility because you're presenting the history and the story of a community. And you've got to get it right, and you've got to try and understand why people, I mean, not individuals, but why communities reacted in the way they did in the past. And because what you're writing is going to maybe be taken up as truth by people, you have to make sure you've got the evidence right. And another factor there is, which one of the things I feel quite strongly is that you can present the evidence to people, which will allow them to draw their own conclusions about history, about, for example, the legacy of the Conservative City Council in Liverpool for nearly 100 years and the way the housing was. So you can present the evidence, I think, is the job of somebody who's writing history. Whereas a novelist is much more free to give characters all sorts of voices to express what people would have been thinking or feeling.
We're going to go to Ronan Bartley now, who doesn't have a I'm ever so sorry. We're going to go to Ronan Bartley now, who has a question for you, but he doesn't have a camera on, so we'll only hear Ronan.
Hello. So my question was, is the intersection between Irish and Liverpool identity one centrally based on class over culture or nationalism, for example?
Let's go to you, Jack.
Well, Greg's the historian, and he does a great job of charting the intersection between the Irish community in Liverpool and the development of the trade unions on the docks and in other places, the trams and the railways and so on, and the Labour Party, the development and the growth of the Labour Party in Liverpool. One of the things that's really clear to me now is that some of the things that affected me growing up in the 60s and 70s go back to the time of the famine and after the famine and the First World War and the sectarian nature of Liverpool in those times, which Greg charts really well. The Conservatives controlled Liverpool for decades. After that, it was the Liberals. It's only recently, a recent kind of phenomenon that Liverpool is seen as, kind of a Labour stronghold. Why was that? Because the Conservatives based themselves on the Protestants and they organised on a sectarian basis. And there was some contest between Irish nationalists who had their own MP in Liverpool up to 1920, I think it was, but Greg would know exactly. And then the Labour Party beginning to develop roots in that. And, the development of the trade unions that partly broke down the sectarianism in those days. In 1909, there were, real riots and battles taking place in the north end of the city. By 1911, the transport strike, both sets of workers had aligned with their class interests as workers to fight for better pay. So it's a story of ups and downs, I think. In the long run, for me, I think class is the most fundamental determining thing. Identities are something we grab hold of. Class is something we live through in that sense. Now, I know there are times when it's the other way around, especially if you were in the north of Ireland or if you were in Ireland in 1916 or 1920. But over the long term, for me, class is what you live through and is your everyday existence that you need to organise around. But that's just me.
The Conservatives in Liverpool built their vote on fear of the Irish, or all through the 19th century into the 20th century. They didn't use it all the time, but when they were in danger of losing an election, they would pull that one out. So it was divide and rule there. In the Irish Nationalist Party, the commitment to the independence or home rule, or whatever the issue was at the time, cut across class. Everybody, the question was, are you Irish? And if you're Irish, you should be supporting home rule or the idea of a parliament in Dublin. once that issue was solved in the minds of Irish people in Liverpool, then it became a more class-based politics in Liverpool. But I think there's a very widespread families in Liverpool whose ancestors not so long ago were dock workers who are now very successful professional people who still retain that commitment to a kind of, it's hard to define it, but it's that commitment to a working class culture. Do those answer your questions, Ronan?
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, both of you.
Thanks for that, Ronan. Gail Fleming has asked, could either of you say, I'm really sorry, I don't know why that's happening. Could either of you say any more about how you think sectarianism lessened in Liverpool in contrast to Glasgow or Belfast?
I think...
Greg, do you want to do this, if you don't mind?
I'll make a start on it. I think... hello, Gail. Nice to see you. Now to hear you. The first point is, I think, is that Liverpool does not have what I call an engine of sectarianism. I think a very good example is the Rangers Celtic thing in Glasgow, where children learn from a young age on what side they're on. And of course, in Belfast, there are also quite a number of institutions and organisations who've got a vested interest in sectarianism. That never came about in Liverpool for various reasons. And I think that is a very important factor. Other factors in Liverpool were that the experience of the Second World War, where bombs fell on everybody along those Docklands community that were so heavily devastated in Liverpool, that gave people a kind of common experience. But my strongest point, along with the guy I mentioned before, Keith Daniel Roberts, is that culture rather than politics or economics played an important part. And I think it's a lesson to us in how important culture can be. I do believe that with success of the Beatles and other Liverpool groups and personalities, when young people in Liverpool saw people with a Liverpool accent being imitated in America and the way they dressed being imitated by American people and others, that they began to think, oh, this Liverpool identity is something, that's what I'm going to be. That's what I'm going to take on. And I think those factors cause people to be proud of their Scouse identity and reject these old-fashioned ideas of Protestantism and Catholicism as a foundation for, sectarian animosity. I could talk for an hour on that, but that's it in a nutshell.
Should we pass it to Jack?
I'll defer to Greg on that, to be honest. I think Greg's got a better understanding of, the longer term events in Glasgow and Belfast. And so, yeah, I'm happy with Greg's answer. Are there any more?
Yeah, so something that we were speaking about previously, and that comes up an awful lot in festival events, is exceptionalism. I wonder whether you think this idea of exceptionalism is helpful, but also where you think it comes from.
I don't know. Okay, I'll go first. I'm not convinced either way by it. I can see why, it happens, but I also think there's a bit of a get out clause there. I understand when people say Scouse, not English. I think it's a kind of safer way for people to, maybe for some people to identify that they're not, in parallel with the Westminster and the Tories down south, without being political, if you like, without kind of drawing the consequences or the conclusions from that. But I think, on another hand, it can be kind of, we're not responsible for what's going on in England, and that's not true. People in Liverpool, same as everywhere else, pay their taxes, vote for the government, and are responsible for what the government does. So I think it's a genuine thing. People are, horrified by the way, the Hillsborough victims were treated, and people know that, which is an ugly, ugly story, the way that happened. And of course, that makes a lot of people, think, fucked a lot of them, basically. And I think that's, an expression that comes through in exceptionalism. For me, there's a bit of a danger that it pretends that we can be an island, or Liverpool can be an island on its own. And it doesn't work like that. I don't know if people remember the Socialist Republic of South Yorkshire. Well, it didn't last long when Margaret Thatcher got in. So I understand it. I think part of it is well motivated, but I think part of it can be kind of dangerous diversion as well. But that's just my view. So far, I'm open to be changed and convinced on that as things develop,
I don't tend to hold with the idea of Liverpool exceptionalism, firstly because I think it's a very tricky thing to claim exceptionalism. You're not really allowed to do that. However, people like, for example, John Belcham, the history professor at Liverpool University, he presents a lot of evidence about certain aspects of Liverpool which were or are exceptional. I think there are dangers in claiming exceptionalism. It can lead to complacency and an inaccurate interpretation of your history. However, there were certain very remarkable things about Liverpool, and those things have left their mark on the city today. There's no doubt about that.
John?
Just the last point from me on this. The two things that, the one thing that defines Liverpool is it being a port. Its location on the Mersey determines almost everything that follows. The two things, look under any stone in Liverpool, you find slavery and you find Irish, and any historical threads then go through both of those. We haven't talked about the slavery element, and even then, there's the slavery and Irish and the Black Irish community in Liverpool. That is something for another day, another subject maybe. But yeah, so I'm not convinced by the exceptionalism, same as Greg.
But I think distinctive might be a better word to use. There certainly is something very distinctive, very different about Liverpool compared to other British cities.
It's a good subject for debate another time. I know some people are really strong kind of adherents for the idea of exceptionalism. And it's not, I wouldn't dismiss it. I think it has to be discussed and debated. It's a genuine view and it has some merit, even if ultimately at this point, I'm not convinced by it. But I think it should be something that we engage with rather than just let it run its course, if you know what I mean.
I'm going to pass to John so that I don't deafen you all. So John's going to close us out.
Thanks, Emma. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Just initially to thank both Greg and Jack for their input this evening. I'm much appreciated it myself. I bought your book online, Jack, while you were talking.
Great. I hope you enjoy it. Leave a review.
I read some reviews previously, and yeah, Great. I'm looking forward to reading that. I've read Greg's book already, and that's a wonderful read. For those of you who are looking for events to drop into, I can recommend, if you've enjoyed tonight's episode, as I'm sure you have, that Wednesday evening, Susan Mackay, or Susan McKay, I don't know how she pronounces her name, is conducting a similar online event looking at Northern Protestants on shifting ground. So I can recommend that to you, 6 o'clock on Wednesday. I should close by noting that the festival has been greatly supported this year by a number of sponsors: Liverpool City Council, for one, the Irish government, our own government, surprisingly you might think, with the Cultural Recovery Fund, the Arts Council, and we have a major project which is underway supported by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, supporting the refreshing of the Liverpool Irish Famine Trail, another subject which Greg Query is very knowledgeable about and indeed helped to create. So thanks to all those organisations. My thanks to you for being here tonight, and once more to Jack and Greg and for Emma who brought it all together. So unless there's anything to add, Emma, then I'm happy to thank you all once more, show our appreciation for our speakers, and look forward to joining you again on Wednesday evening. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, John. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Emma.
And everybody attending. Thank you for listening. It's still on, but I think it's finished now.
Yeah, thank you all for listening.
Okay, Greg, were you okay with that?
Mm-hmm.
Are you there, Greg? I can't see you. I can see John.
I'm still just waiting for people to log out.
Before you start talking about them.
They were a great audience.
I'm going to leave you if you want to have a post-event
Evaluation.
So, cheers. I dare say I won't see you at the session, Greg, so I'll see you soon at some event or other.
Yeah, I might get along actually, John. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Were you okay with that, Greg?
Yes, I was. Yes. Yep.
I mean, I like that it's a genuine discussion. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Yep.
You know, the two things. There's no bullshit, and there's no kind of getting away from things. Just dealing with difficult subjects in an honest way.
Yep. Yep. Yes, I found it very interesting and engaging. I hope I'll be interested to see what our listeners thought of it, because I know a few of them.
All right, yeah.
I hope
It'd be nice to hear some feedback.
Get some feedback. I hope they find it interesting. And it does no harm to, those are issues that I've gone through on, and wrestled with on my own.
Yeah.
Many occasions before when I was writing the book, especially, and it's great to have someone like yourself who also takes an interest in those issues, and who it's interesting to the best way to test your views is to discuss them with somebody else and see where the weak points are and where the problems are, and it also, to be honest, has helped me because there's an awful lot of woolly thinking, and I'm not exempt from that myself, around things about identity and Liverpool identity and all those Liverpool exceptionalism, all those issues.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the romanticism. Do you know what I mean? Kind of I don't have a lot of time for it.
Mm-hmm. So yes, I think you're right up to a point. Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe that's a discussion for another day.
You're a novelist who doesn't like romanticism. I'm a cold-blooded historian who is a bit of a romantic in the corner of my brain. So contradiction.
All right. Well, if I do get back to Liverpool after all this stuff with bloody COVID, then I'll give you a shout. And if you fancy a pint somewhere, then or a cup of tea, whatever.
And so keep on writing. I'm glad. Is the book on schedule for
the spring? The next one, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just doing kind of final edits to it now, but yeah, it's fine. I'll send you an advanced copy if you like. Well, I can only do it digitally now. It's not actually printed or anything.
Yeah. Yeah, you were asking what I was writing about. My lockdown writing was a set of poems about that Speak. I sent you one of them about the Speak Coast and Reserve area and the Oglet Shore area, which is under threat.